We're here at ASCO in Chicago. Joining me now is Jake Van Naarden, the president of Lilly Oncology. Jake, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So when people think of Lilly right now, they typically think of GLP-1's, obesity, diabetes, maybe not so much oncology. Why should they think of Lilly, and what are you guys working on?
Yeah, so Lilly has had success in oncology actually dating back decades. Like some of the first chemotherapies ever invented were Lilly products. Some of the first antibody therapeutics were Lilly products. Some of the first oral targeted therapies were Lilly products. I think where we've struggled is sort of a consistency of success over the years. But despite that, oncology actually is the second biggest therapeutic area at the company even today. Of course, the first biggest, it gets a lot of headlines as a really important set of inventions for human health. But ironically, these two things sort of, in my opinion, work in tandem. All the success we're having with the incretins is allowing us to reinvest in other therapeutic areas, including oncology. And part of what we've been doing over the past couple of years is trying to put Lilly Oncology on more stable footing for the decades to come, in part by changing the kind of science we do, changing the kind of programs that we're pursuing, and in part by taking advantage of the financial strength of the company to be able to move more quickly and take more risk and pursue a lot more programs in parallel in oncology than we've had the ability to do in the past. So I think you'll be hearing more from us in the future with more approved medicines. That's ultimately the currency of the realm, bringing new medicines to patients through the regulatory process. There's been a real synergy with the rest of the company in the ability to do that.
And you have revamped the pipeline really since you came to Lilly. So when should we start to see some of those new approved medicines like you talked about, or some of the results of the work that you've done with the pipeline?
Yeah, and so there's different landmarks in a drug's journey to when it ultimately gets out there. Of course, the final landmark is regulatory approval. We've had a handful of new medicines actually approved over the past couple of years, some brand new and some with new indications. Our hope is to launch our next new medicine, which is a new breast cancer medicine, later this year. So that's pretty exciting. We've already read out positive phase 3 data for the initial indication for that medicine, and more to come there. The next sort of way station on the journey that I look a lot at is when we start phase 3 clinical trials, the last step in the process. We don't make those decisions lightly. They're extremely expensive and very, very time consuming and actually hard to conduct. And so when we say we're going to start a phase 3 program for a medicine, or when we actually start it, that means we have a lot of confidence in it, and that we're basically undertaking the last step in the journey. We'll probably have 3 new medicines enter phase 3 clinical development towards the end of this year, early next year. Those are brand new medicines, one of which we're actually presenting the first clinical data on at this meeting this weekend in ovarian cancer. One of them is in breast cancer, another one is in bladder cancer. So there's a real diversity increasingly to the work that we're doing, not only across disease types within cancer. Of course, we talk about cancer, it's really a collection of 10,000 diseases, but also diversity of the kinds of medicines we're pursuing. Of those 3 that I mentioned, 1 is a new antibody drug conjugate, and 2 are new oral small molecule targeted therapies. So I think you'll be hearing a lot more from us actually in the future, and these phase 3 starts are a leading indicator of what's to come.
And in terms of the modalities and just getting the technology that you want, you've done a few deals over the past few years to increase the technological capabilities. So do you feel like you're done? Do you need to add more?
I think on the technology front, to your point, we've really focused on building out the kind of medicines we can make. A few years ago, when we started this journey, there just were only a few kinds of medicines we even had the technical expertise on a people front and the laboratory tools to build. And that was just very limiting. I would walk around meetings like this and see the kind of innovation that was happening and have ideas of what we wanted to make, but even when we had the idea, we couldn't actually make it. So to your point, we've done a bunch of deal making, we've done a bunch of hiring, and we've built a bunch of institutional know-how around new modalities like antibody drug conjugates, bispecific antibodies, those that can harness your immune system to help kill cancer cells, as well as radioligand therapies delivering high doses of lethal radiation locally to tumors. So I feel really good about the evolution we've been on. Of course, you're reminded at meetings like this about just how many new ideas and new technologies are constantly emerging. So I never want to say we're done. We're not done until we've either cured this disease or turned it into a chronic illness that people can live a long time with. So our goal is to constantly scour the earth, and either if we have to look externally, we do that all the time, to new collaborations or buying things. And increasingly, with the team we've built, we have the ability to do this kind of innovation internally too. So a combination of both is sort of constantly part of the innovation cycle.
So what do you think will be the next big technology? It feels like ADCs were in vogue, a couple years ago, and then RLTs. What's next?
Yeah, I think in our field, there's always these sort of cycles of hype and reality. And I think that sometimes the hype can overshoot the reality, but oftentimes when things are exciting, the reality eventually catches up in a good way and becomes meaningful over time, even if there's some success and failure in the interim. I think ADCs are actually a good example of that. There's been a ton of talk about them, and there's been a lot of success. There's been a sort of some more modest success and some outright failure. I think all of that has made us smarter, actually, about how to build these things. So, the one that we're excited about in ovarian cancer, we learned from precedent molecules, and we built a very specific thing because we had a specific idea from those learnings, and I think we're seeing that bear fruit now with human data that we've generated. That's continuing to happen, actually, even in that one broad class of therapies. So we're doing a ton of work in our labs now, changing out all the modular elements of these antibody-drug conjugates to do things that are, yes, they're ADCs, but they're actually completely different ideas than the things you see in clinical trials walking around meetings like this. So I think you can have the broad category still exist, and yet when you change the details of what exactly they're made of, that differs dramatically. So we're doing a lot of that work in that one modality, and there's analogs of that actually across all the different pillars that we had talked about.
One area, KRAS, right? I mean, that's an area that people were so excited about, and it feels like the commercial opportunity really hasn't lived up to the hype, but you guys have a phase 3 program. So do you think that you'll be able to change the trajectory of what we've seen so far?
Perfect example, actually, of this sort of cycle of excitement meets reality, hopefully meets future excitement. And I think the hopefully piece is the part we need to prove. This is a story that went from KRAS is a super important driver of cancer in a variety of different settings, but we don't know how to drug it. What could we ever do about that? And then, oh wow, we now can drug it and we can shrink tumors, to, oh no, when we give these medicines by themselves to patients who've already been treated with a lot of things, the benefit doesn't last that long. And so our insight was, well, why do these medicines have to be relegated to patients who've already been treated with a lot of things? What if we take these medicines and we combine them with medicines we know work in patients who are newly diagnosed, or even perhaps with early stage disease? Maybe that's actually the setting where these medicines can be really, really impactful. That is our hypothesis, and we're running a huge randomized phase 3 development program, 4 big phase 3 studies that are enrolling right now around the world. And I'm hopeful that when these studies read out, it will reignite some of the excitement that existed in this class a few years ago, and sort of make people realize that it wasn't bad target. It was maybe we didn't have the right medicine, and maybe we weren't studying it the right way in the right setting. But now we know where to use these medicines, and the impact factor is big. That's what I hope we'll be able to prove, but like all things in our field, we have to run the right studies and wait for them to read out and see what we see.
And as part of those studies, though, you are trying some different approaches to enroll those trials faster than you have in the past. So why is clinical trial enrollment in cancer such a problem compared to other therapeutic areas that you're in, like obesity?
Yeah, this is a great question, a passion project for me personally and our organization, but I think endemic to our entire industry. In particular, phase 3 clinical trials, randomized, large, like many hundreds of patients, sometimes thousands of patients clinical trials. These are the ones we're talking about. The early stage studies, actually, they're small. You can enroll those reasonably well. But these later stage studies that actually lead to approvals, they enroll particularly poorly in the United States. Your audience may not know this, but if you take all the patients that have cancer diagnosis in the United States, over the course of their journey, 7% of them will ever enroll in a clinical trial.
That's crazy.
It might as well be zero. It's such a small number. It's like a rounding error. And yet, in many cases, clinical trials are a better option for patients than regular care. But there's a lot of reasons why that happens. And so we've actually stood up internally like a small separate team just trying to figure out the reasons why that's a problem and how to fix it. And you might say like, well, why do you care? As long as you can enroll the studies elsewhere, like I guess you get the studies done. I care for a couple reasons. Number one, that there's a lot of human beings in the United States with cancer, unfortunately, and if they can participate in our clinical trials, we think they can get benefit from that, and we think we can enroll the studies faster and then bring the medicines to all patients around the world more quickly. So that's a win-win. And of course, US regulators and others want to see more US representation in studies that lead to US approval. We totally understand that. We're on the same page with them. We want to help fix that problem. So we're doing a bunch of things differently, and it's early days. I have no idea which of these things will work, but we've changed the financial model for how we run these studies, where instead of having a bunch of things in the course of the study billed to the patient's insurance, we're taking on the cost of all of these items. That's actually how things work in the rest of the company. It's actually even how we run our cancer studies outside of the United States. For reasons that are in some ways like a historical artifact. In the US, that's sort of not how things have been done historically. And there have been instances where patients actually undergo like financial hardship to participate in a clinical trial. That should not happen. So we're taking that on and just changing that, and we hope others do too. We're changing how we're actually writing and conducting our studies, making them easier for patients to participate in, fewer visits, allowing them to use their pre-existing like lab test results to actually qualify for a clinical trial. We're trying to help clinical trial sites around the country with staffing issues and just the work required. You can imagine with all the innovation in artificial intelligence, there's actually a bunch of new software tools that we're deploying to see if we can just help with small things like data entry, which are extremely time consuming and can be a barrier for sites to participate. And then the last thing, and maybe some of your audience have started to see this, we're actually doing a little bit of ad campaigning.
All over the NBA playoffs.
Yeah, okay, so you saw. To try and change perceptions about what a clinical trial is and what that option could be for patients with cancer. I think there's perceptions around clinical trials are what I do when I have no other options, or I don't want to get a placebo. Of course, in oncology that doesn't happen. We don't run placebo-controlled studies. That's unethical. Or I don't want to be treated as a guinea pig, or it's experimental. There's all these perceptions that exist out there about what a clinical trial is. And so, we thought, why don't we take a stab at seeing if we can provide some education to consumers as well as actually physicians and their staffs about what a clinical trial can be for a patient. In many cases, it can be a better alternative than regular care if the study is designed the right way and it's presented to the patient in the right way.
One thing you mentioned, the difference between clinical trial enrollment in the US versus Europe. How much does that have to do with the price of drugs, especially cancer medicines, which are typically very expensive in the US versus Europe and other places around the world?
I think in Europe and other places around the world, those countries have integrated clinical trials as a care model in their practice. Whether it's related to drug pricing or not, it's hard to draw that clear line, but conversely, there's no reason why the United States couldn't do that. In other words, if the pharma company like Lilly is underwriting the cost of care and other medicines that are being delivered in the context of the study, isn't that good for the healthcare system, even in the United States, for clinical trials to be actually maybe even an advantaged option to prescribing branded medicines? And of course, we're in the branded medicines business, I understand that, but there's room for both here. We can enroll our clinical trials and we can deliver our branded medicines to patients as well. And of course, if we do the former, we'll have more of the latter. That's, of course, why we're doing this. This isn't, we see both sides of this.
And the other thing people are talking a lot about, of course, is the changes at the FDA and some of the discussions around what you want to see from a cancer drug before approving a new medicine. So first, have you seen any changes in terms of your discussions with the FDA, the staffing there, and also any expectations in terms of what they want to see before they'll approve any new medicines from you?
Yeah, short answer is no. We haven't really observed that. I've told some others who've asked me this same question in social settings that we have a lot of stuff in front of the agency right now at a variety of different stages. We have a lot going on in the portfolio. That's a good thing. We have new drug applications in front of them, supplemental drug applications in front of them, new phase 3 protocols. We're meeting with them at this point across the portfolio probably once or twice a month on different topics in sort of regular type interactions. I will tell you that like if I never went on X or like read the newspaper and I had no idea what was going on, and all I did was just like put my head down and do my job and show up at these meetings, I would actually have no idea of like what was happening externally. In other words, like it's pretty, at least in oncology, it's pretty normal course, and that's great. We have a reliable regulator, and we're working constructively with them. That's a pretty important thing for the overall system, for that to stay in place in the way that we've gotten accustomed to it. I think when the rules change radically, that is an extremely difficult thing for us to process because these are such long lead time projects. So consistency of the rules, ideally consistency of the people, because ultimately this is a human endeavor. That's pretty important. So far, that's what we've seen. I hope it continues.
Great. Jake, thanks so much for joining us today. Appreciate it. Jake Van
Thanks so much.
Naarden from Eli Lilly. Thanks again.